In 2005, Disney released a Muppet movie that was so universally hated that many cite it as the beginning of the Muppets' fall from grace, something that Disney has tried and failed to crawl itself out of for the past 20 years, even if there have been a few gems. The film in question? The Muppets Wizard of Oz, something that so easily could have worked, but instead turned into a toxic concoction of CGI, thematic confusions, and sexual innuendos. But how? And why? Adaptions of classic literature were the Muppets' bread and butter in the 90s, and this wasn't even the first time the Muppets had ventured down the yellow brick road. As someone who has self-identified as a Muppets historian for the past 4 years, and spends way too much time thinking about Jim Henson's experimental short films from the 60s, the Muppets Wizard of Oz baffles me. I can't help but think of everything that must have gone wrong to turn a match made in heaven into this. I mean, what even makes a good Muppet movie? What makes a good Wizard of Oz adaptation? And how can something fail so spectacularly at being both? Let's take a look. This unsponsored video is brought to you by viewers like you. If you'd like to support my channel, consider donating to the Ko-Fi or Venmo linked in my bio. I am sitting right here on the real yellow brick road, which is to say that I am sitting on a random street corner in Humboldt Park, Chicago. Perhaps more interestingly than the faded yellow brick beneath me is the house right behind me, which has taken the place of the home that L. Frank Baum lived in through the 1890s into the 1910s. It is right here on this street corner in Chicago that the wonderful words of the wonderful Wizard of Oz were first penned. And believe me, the city of Chicago has not forgotten it. Suppose I tap my heels 3 times. I'll end up here in the Fine Arts Building located in the South Loop of Chicago, which is home not only to the last manually operated elevators in the city, but also what was once the studio of illustrator William W. Denslow. It's very possible that the illustrations from that first version of The Wizard of Oz happened right behind this door. The history of The Wizard of Oz is intrinsically tied to the city of Chicago. It's even rumored that the Emerald City was based on the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and references to the story can be seen all over the city. Even if you've never read the book or seen the movie, it's unlikely you wouldn't know the inspiration behind the Yellow Brick Road or the statues at Oz Park. Before the 1939 Technicolored masterpiece starring Judy Garland hit the big screen, there had already been a Broadway stage show and 3 silent pictures based on the novel. Since then, there's been The Wiz, Wicked the Book, Wicked the Musical, Wicked the Movie, Wicked the Move It Again, Oz the Great and Powerful, Return to Oz, Guardians of Oz, After the Wizard, a Phineas and Ferb special, a Victorious special, and 2 Tom and Jerry specials. This isn't even the first time the Muppets have referenced The Wizard of Oz.
I could while away the hours, conferring with the flowers, consulting with the rain.
Or the second, or the third. But why is this? Aside from being incredibly popular, there has to be a reason The Wizard of Oz has been adapted to Oz and back, and likely always will be. And don't get me wrong, the original novel is fantastic, but there are plenty of fantastic novels being written around the same time that haven't received even close to the same treatment. As someone who is approaching this topic from the perspective of a Muppets expert, diving into the social and cultural complexities of a story with such a vast legacy was, to be frank, to be L. Frank Baum, quite intimidating.
I'd follow the yellow brick road.
Why?
And get me out of this theater.
Luckily, I had the opportunity to chat with someone much more knowledgeable.
Hi, I'm Brianna Borger. I'm an assistant professor of instruction at Northwestern University, and I co-teach a course at Northwestern that's based around The Wizard of Oz, looking at how it's been adapted across eras and cultures and mediums, and also diving into how The Wizard of Oz and its iconography have become a part of the American collective consciousness.
I wanted to understand what about The Wizard of Oz lends itself so well to adaptation from a storytelling standpoint, aside from just its standing in the public domain.
I think, first of all, it has a really unique and identifiable structure. If we see a story about someone transported to a new world who makes 3 friends, overcomes some evil, and then has their wishes granted, just those little plot points immediately tell us, this is a story I am familiar with, this is the Wizard of Oz story. So I think that makes things automatically familiar to an audience and really taps into our sense of nostalgia and comfort. I also think the character archetypes within the Oz universe are really universal in a way that lends itself to this myriad of interpretations, right? These themes of like good and evil, home, nostalgia, friendship, self-discovery, finding that what you needed was within you all along. Like, these are all qualities that just about anyone can relate to. So I think it's a really easy source for people to latch on to.
Similarly, The Wizard of Oz is chock full of recognizable iconography. A yellow brick road, sparkly shoes, a blue and white checkered dress. These things mean something. They're just as much a part of the story of The Wizard of Oz as the plot and characters. And they're constantly being referenced, not just in film and TV, but in music, marketing, advertisements, fashion, and so much more.
Just the other day, I saw a State Farm commercial with a scarecrow saying, like, I don't have any brains, but I know that this is the car insurance I would want, or something.
Buying this boat was a total no-brainer.
Okay, I get it. You say no-brainer and the guy with no brain shows up?
That's the Wizard of Oz. We see a scarecrow and we're like, you don't have any brains. So it's kind of incredible how we just automatically understand all of these moments and colors and costumes and design elements that we immediately link to that universe.
Because these symbols are so recognizable, they keep the story relevant in a way a film or book never could. Seeing a sparkly red pair of slippers at Spirit Halloween is a 30-second reminder of Oz, without the time and commitment it would take to consume a full adaptation. It's essentially unintentional, incredible marketing. But what makes this different from other stories is how the public's perception of Oz is influenced less by the original novel and more by a collection of bits and pieces from hundreds of adaptations that each serve as building blocks towards a more generalized collective understanding. For example, the Wicked Witch of the West being green, Dorothy's slippers being red, the wizard showing himself as a giant head, these are all elements of countless Oz adaptations and are generally considered essential parts of the Oz story, but none of them were actually in the original novel, and were instead introduced in the 1939 film.
I think it's true the 1939 film has become what we would call like the hypotext of the Oz universe.
Hypotext is a literary term referring to an earlier piece of work, frequently a text, that serves as the source material for a later, likely transformed text. Romeo and Juliet is the hypotext for Nomeo and Juliet. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is the hypotext for A Muppet Christmas Carol, also by Charles Dickens.
Hey, wait a second, you're not Charles Dickens.
So when you see the ruby red rain boots and the bright green Dr. Doofenshmirtz in Phineas and Ferb's Wizard of Oz, the hypotext isn't the original novel. Rather, it's the 1939 film that introduced both of these visual elements to the collective Oz canon.
It simply has reached a greater audience. It has had greater longevity than the book. It has all the colorful iconography. And so these are like all things that we commonly see reference to in adaptations and homages because film is a visual media form, unlike the book where we're all imagining our own version of that possibly, right?
But even then, the general public's perception of Oz is so much more than just the 1939 film. It is a collective memory created through the popularity of hundreds of adaptations. In 2025, the piece of media that is largely changing the way people remember the original story is Wicked, whose popularity has skyrocketed thanks to the release of the film adaptations. Not only were they a huge financial and critical success, but they also often served as the first introduction to the world of Oz for younger generations. As a full-time babysitter, I have met plenty of kids who know every single word to Defying Gravity and have no idea who Dorothy is. But even with slightly older generations, this is the most relevant Oz has been for a lot of people in a really long time. Brianna described to me an activity she did with her class of mostly 18 and 19-year-olds, where she had them write out the story of the Wizard of Oz from memory.
And it was fascinating because in 4 years of teaching this class, this was the first time that students, in just recalling the Wizard of Oz story, listed Nessarose as a character, Fiyero as a character, referred to the Wicked Witch as Elphaba, and a great number of them said that Dorothy throws water on the witch and thinks that she's killed her, but the Wicked Witch escapes, which is fully taken from the Wicked plot.
What's fascinating to me is that this interview was conducted before the second Wicked movie was released, and therefore, in order to know that Elphaba escapes at the end, some of these students had to have already been influenced by by the original stage show, likely more than they even realized. Remember, this is an activity where students were challenged to write out The Wizard of Oz, not Wicked. And even then, the director of the Wicked films, John M. Chu, talks about how he treats the Wicked stage musical and the 1939 film as his source text, as opposed to the Wicked novel by Gregory Maguire or the original Wizard of Oz novel by L. Frank Baum. And he does that simply because these adaptations are more recognizable than their source text. When writing this video, I was having a really hard time describing the weird, ever-changing world of the Oz canon. Because despite not being in the books, I would feel weird saying that the witch being green isn't canon. The way that the general public engages with the Wizard of Oz reminds me a lot more of my experiences in fandom than it does my experiences in academia. Because what is Wicked if not a crazy popular piece of Wizard of Oz fanfiction? But Brianna described it in a different way.
The book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is largely considered the first true American myth, which I think is really fascinating.
And of course, when we say the first American myth, we're referring to America, the country, not the continents of North and South America. Because the real first American myths were created by indigenous people.
And I think it totally lives up to that label because this story is constantly revised and reinterpreted and reapplied to all these different cultures and contexts and audiences. And so there's no one true version of the Greek and Roman myths, right? Like, we see all kinds of different versions of these gods and monsters. The Wizard of Oz is just our American version of that, and it continues to prove to be that.
So clearly, all of this makes the question of what makes a good Wizard of Oz adaptation a lot harder to answer, because book accuracy simply hasn't been a factor in a lot of really popular and really successful adaptations. And I would argue that in a lot of cases, straying from book accuracy is actually what made these adaptations so successful in the first place. The 1939 film, believe it or not, is significantly less dark than the original novel, and this is partly why it appealed to a larger target demographic in the first place. Even more fascinating is how each adaptation is a product of its time, both what was happening in the film and theater and television industry, but also what was happening socially and politically. The Wiz, written at the tail end of the Black Arts movement, surprisingly takes a lot of inspiration from the original novel, but it is most successful in the moments it uses Oz's simple story to celebrate Black art and joy. The stage show was also a product of the technology being pushed on Broadway at the time.
In the mid-1970s, like, Broadway had just figured out body mics so they could actually have a score that was like R&B and disco inspired.
The Wicked musical came out during the third wave of the feminist movement with two complex female leads, and is largely defined by its intentional twisting of the Oz story in order to examine good and evil, political corruption, and how privilege impacts a person's activism.
There's also another musical adaptation called Somewhere Over the Border by a writer named Brian Quijada, which is about a young Mexican woman making her way to America, which is such a timely story. And the musical is wonderful, and it's just such a fantastic example of how using the structure of the Oz story can create familiarity with audiences who maybe do not personally relate to the journey that this young woman is going on.
So no, I don't think it's fair to say that book accuracy is what makes a good adaptation. However, I do think there are some things the general public has come to expect from a Wizard of Oz story. This isn't to say that these things are essential to a good Oz adaptation, rather that there is an expectation that this criteria will be met, and if it isn't, audiences expect that that will be for a good reason. I have consumed a lot of Wizard of Oz adaptations over the course of the past few months, and despite all of them being wildly different, here are some similarities I noticed in the films that I found the most successful. Obviously, this is a subjective list, but when has film criticism ever been objective? These are my opinions based on the research that I have done, and I cannot wait to be proven wrong a million times in the comment section down below.
I think it's really hard to be specific as to what makes a good adaptation, because adaptation can take so many forms, and who am I to say what might be good until someone tries to accomplish it and they succeed or they don't?
Let's dive into it. Number 1. Themes of belonging. If anything remains accurate to the original novel in most Oz adaptations, it is the story's universal themes.
I think the themes that are central to Wizard of Oz are what makes that story feel correct to us or feel like right. And to me, those are themes of friendship, home, or belonging.
More specifically, the story is about finding a place you belong, often a community you are already a part of, and returning to that place. I would also argue that this is less about a physical place and more about the community and people that exist there. Sure, Dorothy wants to return to Kansas, but I think it's less about Kansas and more about the family that she left behind. Number 2. Characters who care about each other. This is a journey the protagonist rarely goes on alone, and is instead aided by a group of caring and compassionate friends. It is the teamwork and desire to reach a collective goal that I think is at the core of Oz's messaging about friendship. We love these characters because they love each other. Sure, they all get something they want in the end, but even in moments where it would have been easier, they never leave each other behind. There is a level of respect among the group, which feels particularly important because the group is usually a young woman surrounded by grown men. Number 3. A land worth protecting. Originally, I had a bullet point describing the whimsical aesthetic of Oz. Even if that magic often looks different, it is always there. There is something whimsical about the colors, costume designs, and characters, and I personally think the best adaptations allow for a certain level of joy and silliness. That being said, I think what's more important is the purpose of this whimsical magic. There is an understanding that even if there is darkness that must be dealt with, there is great beauty in the land of Oz. Even in Return to Oz, which is an incredibly dark adaptation, Dorothy is insistent that Oz is a land worth protecting, and I couldn't agree more. These next 2 bullet points are slightly cheating because I do think that they depend on the adaptation being in a specific medium, but I do think that they are relevant to specifically the discussion of the Muppets Wizard of Oz, because that's what this video is about. Did you forget that that's what this video is about? Number 4. Practical effects. Perhaps I'm a bit biased because I am a puppetry fiend, but I couldn't help but notice that the Oz film adaptations, whose visual styles have remained the most popular, are largely defined by their practical effects. I don't think it's a jump to say the wonder inspired by the massive sets, beautifully painted backdrops, and never-before-seen effects is part of why the iconography from the 1939 film has stuck with us for so long. Granted, all of these films were made before CGI became the norm, but even Wicked has been praised for constructing nearly the entirety of the set practically. There has, at least to me, always been something distinctly handmade about the Wizard of Oz. Whether that's because the Scarecrow and Tin Man were literally created by fictional craftsmen in the story, or because I've seen 100 kids in 100 different handmade Halloween costumes. The tactile nature of it, the understanding that Oz can and has existed because artists have cared enough to create it, this is essential to how the story is perceived. And I'm not the first person to rip apart a film that turned Oz into a CGI dystopia. Number 5. Music. Again, this one is definitely dependent on the medium of the adaptation, but it's relevant to The Muppets Wizard of Oz, because this video is about The Muppets Wizard of Oz. We're gonna talk about the Muppets eventually.
Musical theater and the Wizard of Oz universe are their own kind of dynamic system over the last 100+ years, because there have been new musical versions of the Wizard of Oz for every iteration of musical theater changing as an art form. And the fact that musical theater is one of our 2 wholly American art forms, it makes sense that musical theater would go along with our original American myth, right? And just kind of like hold hands, jaunt down the yellow brick road together, and create all of these incredible adaptations.
So that is a lot of information about the Wizard of Oz. But if you remember what I said earlier in the video, the Muppets Wizard of Oz fascinates me because it manages to fail as both a Wizard of Oz adaptation and a Muppet movie. I've seen a lot of videos breaking down the film from the perspective of an Oz fan or a Muppets fan, but I wanted to talk about it from the perspective of both. But first, similar to what we just did, we have to define what makes a good Muppet movie. Don't worry, this section will go a lot faster. Number 1. characters who care about each other. The Muppets have incredibly specific character dynamics full of popular archetypes. But perhaps more importantly, despite being written with the intention of creating contrast and conflict, the Muppet characters care deeply for one another. They are a family. Their care and connection to one another is part of what makes them so memorable.
I don't care if no one believes in us because I believe in you.
And that care and friendship is at the core of the majority of their films. A clear understanding of the reality of their world. Just like there are rules to the fantasy world of Oz in each adaptation, there is a defined reality of the worlds that each Muppet movie takes place in, which most commonly means that singing frogs and dancing chickens are completely normal occurrences. When Kermit the Frog walks into a bar, he's treated like any other customer, and the human actors, because there are human actors, interact with the Muppets in the same way they'd interact with normal human adults. This is technically a fantasy, but it is treated completely seriously, and that sincerity is essential to the tone of these films. Comedy. Despite often leaning into visual gags, puns, and wordplay, there is a cleverness to the Muppets' comedy. The joke is very rarely that the Muppets exist and are adults. When there is innuendo, it's not funny because the Muppets know about sex. It's funny because it's written and delivered well. There is a self-seriousness to the comedy that makes it feel slightly more elevated than you would maybe expect from a puppet show, and that is very, very important. Practical effects. Perhaps this is more obvious than my argument for practical effects in Oz, but the Muppets are, believe it or not, puppets. Practical effects have been a key part of their existence from the very beginning, and while recent projects have leaned a little bit more into CGI, their constant dedication to craftsmanship and desire to push the boundaries of what puppetry can do on screen has and will always be part of their legacy. Music. Similar to The Wizard of Oz, the Muppets have a beautiful relationship with music. The Muppet Show was a musical variety show. The majority of their films are cram-packed with original songs, and I would argue the popularity of some of those songs surpasses the popularity of the films themselves. Not to mention their collaboration with artists like John Denver and Lady Gaga. It's music. It's important. It's part of the blood running through the Muppets. Or the foam, if you will. So for all intents and purposes, and in an attempt to not make this any more complicated than it already is, those are the things that I look for in an Oz adaptation and a Muppet movie. And hopefully, you're noticing the same patterns I'm noticing, which is that the things that make a successful Oz adaptation are the things the Muppets do best. Both have characters that explore specific archetypes, characters that thrive on their friendships and connections to one another. Both create fantasy worlds that may vary in how whimsical they are, but still follow a clear set of rules that give logic to their realities. I wouldn't say The Wizard of Oz is a comedy, but it's proven time and time again to lend itself well to slapstick and physical humor that the Muppets are known for, while still having a tremendous amount of sincerity. A balance of tones that, yet again, the Muppets have done successfully in the past. And of course, both of them are largely associated with music and practical effects. All of this is to say, the Muppets and The Wizard of Oz are a match made in heaven. They play off of each other's strengths incredibly well, and since the story of Oz is fairly simple, there's plenty of room to give it a Muppety twist. And of course, the Muppets are in good hands, right? I mean, surely these writers had been writing for these characters for decades at this point, and there certainly weren't any big transitions of power happening that might have impacted the production of a low-budget TV special, right? In 1989, Jim Henson was growing wary of the responsibilities of running his own company and decided to sell his properties to someone higher up on the food chain. If you clicked on this video, I'm assuming that you already know who Jim Henson is, but if you don't, he is the puppeteer and mastermind behind projects like The Muppet Show, Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Labyrinth, and The Dark Crystal. And he's largely responsible for revolutionizing puppetry in film and television. By 1989, he had been working as the head of the Jim Henson Company, which was founded in 1958, for over 30 years. The hope was that by selling the company, Jim would be able to be more involved in the creative processes of his various projects. And having his properties bought by a larger company would bring more recognition to the studio and, ideally, higher budgets. Jim knew it would be fairly easy to sell his properties because, to be frank, the Muppets were a phenomenon, and Jim Henson was not only a household name, but regarded by many as a creative genius. The tricky part would be selling the properties to the right company, because anyone who knew Jim knew that it was Disney or nothing. Having discreetly inquired about stepping in as Disney's new president, or even flat out buying the company in 1984, Jim was obsessed with Disney. Quote, "The first film I saw was Snow White, and ever since then I've had a secret desire to work with this great company." End quote. Jim may have loved Disney's animated features, quote, "Outside of my own films, these are the only ones I buy from my video library," end quote, he wrote privately. But he was an even bigger fan of the Disney theme parks. Disneyland and Walt Disney World were, he said, quote, "two of my favorite places," end quote, and he had made regular vacations to the two parks for decades. To be fair, there is also a video of Jim Henson saying the first movie he ever saw was, funny enough, The Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz was the very first film I ever saw, and it's still my favorite picture. But this picture, I think, it was a wonderful thing for the whole fantasy world, because it gave us a complete fantasy world and opened the way for other filmmakers to do entire movies set in a fantasy world.
But considering both of these films came out less than a year apart and Jim was 2 or 3, I will forgive the confusion. Disney had also proven its ability to honor the legacy and maintain the popularity of many pre-existing characters long after their creators passed away, including Walt's own characters and their recent adaptations of Winnie the Pooh. And of course, the Disney company would also benefit greatly. The Little Mermaid, a film often credited for pulling the company out of the financial disaster known as the Dark Age of Disney, was still in early stages of production, with no one having any way of knowing how successful it would be. What they did know is that they had been burdened with flop after flop and needed a solution fast. So recently appointed CEO Michael Eisner made it his mission to acquire a new collection of popular and financially lucrative characters. And truly, I cannot overstate how popular Jim Henson's characters were. For the first time in a while, the Jim Henson Company owned all of its properties. The Muppet Show was constantly rerunning on cable, merchandise sales for shows like Fraggle Rock and Muppet Babies were consistent and impressive, and a steady stream of films had been released for over a decade. At this point in time, the studio was pivoting away from television and towards feature films, even attempting to change the name of the company from Henson's Associates to Jim Henson Productions, and remodeling the logo to something that looks suspiciously like the Disney logo, a big, swooping signature. And of course, the characters were only half of the appeal, with Jim Henson's own creative mind serving as the most valuable asset of them all. Frank Oz, Jim's right-hand man and the puppeteer behind characters like Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Bert, and Cookie Monster, said this, quote, "It was never just selling the Muppets. It was always in conjunction with him being there as the main creative guy who could help the company. Jim felt he could be Walt Disney," end quote. Michael Eisner, who Jim Henson would go into negotiations with, said this, quote, "It's special because you get a guy like Jim, who brings a new creative vitality to the company. That's really the reason for the whole deal. Plus, you get the Muppets," end quote. It seemed like a match made in heaven, and the Jim Henson Company promptly went into negotiations with the Walt Disney Company. Here was the proposal. For $150 million of Disney stock, Jim would sell all of his copyrights to Disney. The Muppets, Fraggle Rock, The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, and everything aside from Sesame Street. This, of course, means that Disney could use the characters however they see fit. They could make more movies, integrate them into the parks, and profit from brand new merchandise. At the same time, Jim would work exclusively for Disney for the next 15 years, which would not only secure him a job, but also prevent him from using his creative powers to benefit any of Disney's competitors. Despite all of this seeming like a win-win, negotiations were long and frustrating. Throughout the entire negotiation process, 3 issues continue to be the subject of debate. The first was that Disney repeatedly tried to convince Jim to include the Sesame Street characters in the deal, despite the fact that he told them Sesame Street was off limits as early as their first meeting. This not only prolonged negotiations, but lowered morale between the two companies. The second issue was the integrity of the characters themselves. Jim wanted to be involved in the casting of all puppeteers, and reassurance that curtain performers would not only remain employed, but would be treated well and paid fairly after the deal went through. Jim believed his properties were only as successful as his performers, and insisted that their collaboration was what made the characters who they were. Eisner argued that it was impossible to legally commit to such abstract terms. And the final issue was what to do with Kermit the Frog. Quote, "While Jim was prepared to hand over all of the Muppets to Disney, he didn't intend for Kermit to go with them unconditionally. He was too important. Quote, Kermit should be treated in the negotiations as a separate issue. Since Kermit the Frog is so closely associated with Jim Henson must have control over the use of Kermit." Naturally, Disney was resistant. Getting the Muppets without free use of Kermit the Frog was like getting Disney without free use of Mickey Mouse. Still, even with all of these issues, things were looking promising. The Muppets' integration into the parks was well on its way, including production for a 4D attraction titled Muppet Vision 3D. More than anything, Jim Henson seemed determined to make the deal happen. Looking way back down the road, when I stopped sitting in my rocking chair and working Kermit the Frog, I really like the idea of characters living on in the Disney parks. It's a wonderful future for these characters. It's as close to an eternal life as a little green frog can get. End quote. In 1990, the deal was just about finalized, and Jim Henson had a meeting with Michael Eisner to finally sign the agreement. Things were looking up, and then the unthinkable happened. At 1:21 a.m., May 16, 1990, Jim Henson passed away in a New York hospital on East 86th Street. The official cause of death was septic shock. This was devastating. Not only had the world lost one of the best creative minds of the era, but the Jim Henson Company was forced to find a way to continue the success of the industry that Jim Henson not only created, but dominated. And the deal with Disney? Well, it never went through, or at least not in the way everyone expected. While the company did help produce some of the future Muppet movies like A Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island, the Jim Henson Company remained the sole owner of their properties, until they sold everything to a German-based media company, EMTV, in 2000 for $680 million. And when I say everything, I mean everything, even the highly sought-after Sesame Street characters. They'd worked with the company before, mainly to help license their products in Germany, and EMTV was considered one of the fastest-growing media companies at the time. It just didn't have the same reputation or stability as Disney. The EMTV era is not regarded very highly in comparison to eras that came before it. The company made a pivot from higher-budget movies to lower-budget TV specials, with the most notable releases being Kermit's Swamp Years and It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. Both of these films mark a pretty large shift in the style of the Muppet movies, not just in their budget, but in their tone and type of comedy. Not to mention the target audience of the Muppets as a collective started to get a bit more blurred, something that would become even more apparent in The Muppets Wizard of Oz. Shortly after the deal, EMTV's stocks plummeted, and in 2003, they sold the Jim Henson Company back to the Henson family for $84 million, which, oh my god. And it appears that the Hensons never planned on keeping the characters because, in 2004, finally, after over a decade of history, Disney officially bought the Muppets. Just the Muppets. No Sesame Street, no Fraggle Rock, no Labyrinth or the Dark Crystal, just the Muppets from the Muppet Show, their film and TV library, and Bear in the Big Blue House, for some reason. But now what? Because this was far from the deal Jim Henson envisioned back in 1989. There would be no Muppet theme park takeovers, no new films with Jim Henson at the helm, and far fewer properties than originally planned. What do you do with a franchise you've been fighting for over a decade, when by the time it finally ends up in your hands, it is far from its prime? If only there was a film already in production. Perhaps something tied to a well-known story with a felt frog twist, maybe starring an up-and-coming pop star. What could go wrong, right? Right? By the time Disney got their hands on The Muppets Wizard of Oz was already in pre-production with ABC, which, let me remind you, was, and still is, owned by Disney. Starting in April of 2004, the Muppets had slowly started reminding the public of their relevance through TV advertisements and appearances on shows like Extreme Makeover, Home Edition, Good Morning America, and Saturday Night Live.
Now it's Extreme Makeover Ham Edition.
The hope was to get people thinking about the Muppets again, so by the time that the special aired, they'd have decent viewership. The film was to be directed by Kirk Thatcher, who'd been working with the Muppets since 1987. At 18, he was employed by George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, where he designed, built, painted, and puppeteered creatures for projects like Star Trek, E.T., Gremlins, Poltergeist, Return of the Jedi, and so much more. His work with the Muppets began with the Jim Henson Hour. Later, he developed, produced, and wrote the 1991 show Dinosaurs, was on the writing staff for Muppets Tonight, and co-wrote Muppets Treasure Island. Before Muppets Wizard of Oz, his only Muppety directorial credit was It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie, but he would go on to direct A Muppet's Christmas, Letters to Santa, A Muppet Haunted Mansion, and that one YouTube video of the Muppets singing Bohemian Rhapsody. If you're like me, you're likely noticing a pattern. TV specials, or at least Disney Plus specials, seem to be Thatcher's bread and butter, and the shift in the production style of the Muppets seems to go hand in hand with when he became the primary director for the characters. We can see a very similar shift happen more recently, when we transitioned out of Muppets 2011 and Muppets Most Wanted, which were both directed by different artists, back into A Muppet Haunted Mansion and Muppets Now, both directed by, again, Kirk Thatcher. Before anyone in the comments tries to tell me that I'm wrong and that Kirk Thatcher did not direct Muppets Now, he did. He's credited as Rufus Scott Church, but it was him. They're the same person, and he did direct a few episodes. I swear to God. So perhaps the tone of A Muppet's Wizard of Oz isn't all that surprising. Similarly, despite having a relatively large writing team, with Deborah Frank and Steve L. Hayes working on the story and teleplay, and Adam Goldberg and Tom Martin working on just the teleplay, none of the writers had extensive experience when it came to writing for the Muppets. Only one of them had ever written for the Muppets prior, and 3 out of the 4 of them would never write with the Muppets again. This, paired with a transition of studio power and a lower budget, might explain a little bit of why the Muppets Wizard of Oz ended up the way that it did, even if there were still a few consistent people on board, like Bill Beretta and Lisa Henson as executive producers, Polly Smith as a costume designer, and the majority of the principal Muppet cast, aside from Frank Oz, whose roles would be played by Eric Jacobson, returning for the project. Steve Whitmire would play Kermit, Dave Goelz would play Gonzo, and Bill Beretta would play Pepe the King Prawn. The human cast would include pop star Ashanti as Dorothy Gale, Queen Latifah as Auntie M, David Alan Grier as Uncle Henry, and Quentin Tarantino as himself. We will get back to that. The movie was promoted with commercials that put a Wizard of Oz twist on famous ABC shows at the time, as well as ads in magazines.
Guys, I think we're
Don't say it! Don't say it!
We need to face the facts!
No, don't say it!
No, he's right. We're lost.
The Muppets also appeared on shows like America's Funniest Home Videos, Jimmy Kimmel Live, The Tony Danza Show, and Good Morning America. Which may seem a bit random, but this symbiotic marketing is something the Muppets had done in the past and would continue to do in the future. I mean, who else remembers the Muppets on Good Luck Charlie? In March of 2005, Ashanti would reveal 6 window displays as part of the Macy's Flower Show. Each window featured scenes from the movie paired with fresh flowers, which might also seem a bit random, but they had done something similar with It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas. Window 1 featured Kermit the Frog reading Oz for Dummies under a sign for Auntie M's Diner. Window 2 depicts Munchkinland, complete with half a dozen rats. Windows 3 through 5 depict the Muppet versions of the Scarecrow, Tin Thing, and Cowardly Lion respectively, and Window 6 showcases the characters standing in front of the gates to the land of Oz. The Macy's flagship store also offered an exclusive plush and t-shirt, which is pretty cool. The movie premiered on April 27, 2005 at the Tribeca Film Festival, introduced by Kermit the Frog and Robert De Niro. Muppets Wizard of Oz follows the story of a young Dorothy Gale, who dreams of escaping her life as a waitress at her aunt and uncle's Kansas diner in favor of being a star. Despite being a singer and a star are 2 different things, and the movie takes time to make sure we know that. After giving a CD of her music to the Muppets, who were auditioning people in her small town, she and her house are swept away by a tornado, landing her in the wonderful land of Oz. From this point forward, The Muppets Wizard of Oz hits a lot of the beats you would expect from an Oz adaptation. Dorothy's house lands on the Wicked Witch of the East, she journeys down the Yellow Brick Road, where she meets three friends, the Scarecrow, played by Kermit the Frog, the Tin Thing, played by Gonzo, and the Cowardly Lion, played by Fozzie Bear. They meet the wizard, who tells them to destroy the Wicked Witch of the East, which they do. They find out the wizard is a fraud, but they get all their gifts anyway. You know the story. The film also takes a surprising amount of inspiration from the original novel, as opposed to the 1939 film. The Shoes are Silver, the Good Witch of the North, and Glinda the Good Witch are two separate characters, both played by Miss Piggy, but decidedly two separate characters, and the field mice are played by a group of rats. So, close enough. I know that in this movie, the rats are introduced as the Munchkins, but in the book, the characters who rescue Dorothy and the lion from the poppy field by hoisting them up on their tiny little bodies and carrying them away are not the Munchkins. It is a group of tiny itty bitty little field mice. So yes, they're introduced as the Munchkins, but within the plot of the story, they serve the function of the field mice. Are you catching my drift? Do you understand what I'm saying to you? And of course, there are some things that are unique to this version of Oz, like the fact that the poppy field is an opioid den, Toto is a king prawn who makes way too many sexual references, and Dorothy couldn't care less about returning home when she would much rather be a pop star. Also, Quentin Tarantino is there, for some reason. The responses from critics and audiences were rough, to say the least. Muppets Wizard of Oz currently has the lowest score out of any Muppet movie, including the TV specials, on IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Letterboxd. Immediately after its release, critics said this: "Something's gone horribly wrong at Muppet Central, and it's high time somebody fix it. A disastrous failure. We're a long way from the creative energy, heart, and charm of the Henson Muppet movies, even though I'm not ready for the Henson Company to stop trying." And more casual viewers were just as quick to tear the film to shreds, both in 2005 and today. Die-hard Oz fans don't like it either.
I find it incredibly hard to watch, personally. I think it leans so hard into the kind of raunchy comedy that was so pervasive in the culture in the early 2000s, but just feels so off-brand for the Muppets to me.
Now obviously, something, or perhaps more accurately, lots of things, about the Muppet Wizard of Oz don't work. And it would be all too easy for me to make a comical commentary, picking apart every bad joke or questionable character decision. Instead, I want to see how well the film holds up when put through the criteria we established earlier. What makes a good Oz adaptation? What makes a good Muppet movie? They are impossible questions to answer, but I didn't spend all that time justifying a bullet point list for no reason. So let's consult the criteria. Themes of belonging. Perhaps one of the most notable changes The Muppets Wizard of Oz makes to the Oz story is that Dorothy, despite being whisked away to an unfamiliar land, has absolutely no desire to return home. Her journey to meet the wizard is motivated by her desire to become a pop star. This version of Dorothy hates Kansas, and perhaps more importantly, acts like she hates Auntie Em and Uncle Henry as well. She shows zero gratitude for being taken in and actively insults the diner they've dedicated their lives to running. And don't get me wrong, I would not eat at that diner either. But when you take a character known for her devotion to her loving family and turn her into a character that cares about nothing but her claim to fame, you're going to end up with a protagonist that's less likable. Every choice that Dorothy makes from this point on feels less important because the stakes feel impossibly lower. And I say this as a person who works in the arts. Not becoming a pop star is not as serious of a consequence as being swept away from everyone you've ever known and loved for the rest of your life. And while Dorothy does eventually return home, seemingly having learned her lesson, she almost instantly is offered a chance to tour with the Muppets, which she takes, leaving behind Kansas yet again and undermining the message the film barely earned in the first place. Characters who care about each other. Perhaps my most controversial opinion about The Muppets Wizard of Oz is that I do believe that these characters like each other, or at least some of them do. The core four, which is how I refer to Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Thing, and the Cowardly Lion, play off of each other incredibly well. They constantly stand up for one another and do a really good job of balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. However, I do think that there are a lot of choices elsewhere in the film that make it easy to miss that camaraderie, and in some cases even belittle the friendship that is so important to the story. The first is the casting of Miss Piggy as the Wicked Witch of the West. This isn't the first time the Muppets have faced a cruel and violent antagonist, but it is the first time that that antagonist has been played by one of the actual Muppets. These films indeed need a villain to push the story forward, but when that villain is Miss Piggy, we're forced to watch a member of this tight-knit community that we love treat other members of that community terribly. Which isn't to say that Miss Piggy, or really any of the Muppets, have always been kind, just to say that the cruelness has never been quite this bad. It not only feels out of character, but also changes the dynamic of the group, a dynamic built on the characters' love and care for one another. The second factor is that there is one character that absolutely does not care about anyone but himself. I am of course talking about Pepe the King Prawn, who fills so much of the runtime with sexual innuendos and jokes at the expense of other characters, often directly after what should have been a genuine or heartfelt moment, which completely undercuts the emotional impact of these scenes. Because Pepe doesn't take the friendship seriously, it feels like the movie doesn't take the friendship seriously, leaving us with a hollowed out emotional core and lack of commitment to the most important relationships. Clear understanding of the reality of the world. There are two main elements of this film that feel inconsistent. The first is that by having the Muppets exist in this version of Kansas, the magic of Oz is dimmed. What's so special about a talking scarecrow, tin thing, or lion when talking animals, monsters, and robots alike already exist in the non-magical world? No wonder Dorothy isn't particularly wowed by Oz. The second place the reality of the world falters is the social standings of the Muppets themselves. This movie cannot seem to decide if the Muppets are adults or children. Socially, they function as adults. In Kansas, they run their own company, drive a tour bus, and watch Girls Gone Wild. Throughout the entire film, they speak like adults, referencing sex and drugs in multiple scenes. But the film is insistent on being a children's movie, and therefore, the Muppets are spoken to like children. In a 2005 article by Entertainment Weekly, Ashanti is quoted saying this, quote, "I love children, and to me, the Muppets are just like little kids," end quote. Unfortunately, I do think Ashanti's infantilizing perspective on the Muppet characters seeps into the way that she interacts with them, causing a dissonance between the very adult humor the film insists on having and the way that they are constantly spoken to like children who don't know better. I also want to make it abundantly clear that I am not blaming Ashanti for this. Finding consistency is a director's job, and it appears to me that he spent more time emphasizing how to act with puppets than encouraging her to behave like she is surrounded by actual actors. Quote, "The director had to give me a few pointers and tips for acting with them. The most important thing that I learned was to keep eye contact." When cast as Scrooge in A Muppet Christmas Carol, Michael Caine famously said this, quote, "I am going to play this movie like I am working with the Royal Shakespeare Company. I will never wink. I will never do anything Muppety," end quote. It is that level of sincerity from the human actors that is essential to the Muppets' existence as more than just a gimmick. Eye contact is important, but something that is equally as important is understanding the inner complexities of the Muppet characters, something that should exist inside the Muppets' heads just as much as they should exist in Dorothy Gale's. Practical effects. Before I talk about the CGI in this movie, because good lord is there CGI in this movie, I want to take some time to talk about elements of the production design that I do enjoy. As always, I am a big fan of Polly Smith's costume designs, specifically for the Muppets. The texture of Kermit's collar and Fozzie's mane, as well as the overall structure of Gonzo as the Tin Thing are delightful. The little outfits the rats wear as munchkins, while not Polly's best work, still help define this trashy, run-down version of Oz that the film seems intent on creating. As far as I'm concerned, Polly Smith can do no wrong when costuming the Muppets. Unfortunately, the Muppets themselves, a few backdrops, and effects like steam or flashing lights are the extent of this film's reliance on practical effects. This is likely partly because of the film's lower budget, but I can't help but think how much better it would have aged if they had relied on puppets or in-camera effects, instead of some of the worst CGI I have ever seen in my entire life. Perhaps the worst offender is the scene where the gang meets the wizard for the first time. Each of them enter his chambers alone, where he appears to them in drastically different forms, usually somehow tied to one of their personal weaknesses. This is a scene pulled straight from the original novel, but at least in the novel, the writing isn't so lewd, and when you read a book, you can picture the characters looking however you want them to. And I don't think anyone was picturing the CGI monstrosities Muppets Wizard of Oz is about to unleash on the world. Let's remember that within the context of the original book, the wizard doesn't actually have any magical powers. After the group defeats the Wicked Witch of the West, it's revealed that not only is the wizard an ordinary man, but that the magical forms he appeared to them as were created using tricks that he'd learned from his time in the circus.
He pointed to one corner, in which lay the great head, made out of many thicknesses of paper, and with a carefully painted face.
"This I hung from the ceiling by a wire,"
said Oz.
"I stood behind the screen and pulled a thread to make the eyes move and the mouth open."
He showed the Scarecrow the dress and the mask he had worn when he seemed to be the lovely lady, and the Tin Woodman saw his terrible beast was nothing but a lot of skins sewn together, with slats to keep their sides out. As for the ball of fire, the false wizard had hung that also from the ceiling. It was really a ball of cotton, but when oil was poured upon it, the ball burned fiercely.
Not only is the magic in the book done practically, but it gives us a step-by-step explanation for how the wizard made it happen. The choice to instead use CGI drains this scene of its magic. There's no question of how it was done. Everyone knows it was animated on a computer. Not only does it rob the Land of Oz of some of its wonder, but it robs the Muppets of an opportunity to do what they do best. You're telling me the people who created the Dark Crystal couldn't create a ball of fire? That the craftsman who mounted a collection of Muppets on moving bicycles couldn't hang a head from the ceiling that blinks at the pull of a string? Yeah, I doubt that. It doesn't help that this film was made towards the beginning of Hollywood's reliance on CGI, and a lot of it has aged incredibly poorly. I can't help but wish that I was looking at something pretty enough to make up for the bad writing, and this is just one of a lot of examples. Oz is a land worth protecting. In most versions of The Wizard of Oz, Oz is a sacred place. In The Muppets Wizard of Oz, you get the feeling that kindness is rare. This is probably largely because of the casting of Miss Piggy and the snark of Pepe, but wicked witches and opioid dens are rarely balanced out by something gentler. And when they are, that gentleness isn't taken seriously. Kindness is an afterthought and a snarky sense of humor, a problem made worse by some characters' individuality complexes. Music. The music is fine. I don't mind the poppier sound, but the lyrics aren't particularly impressive, and the songs are often used to set the mood rather than push the story along. While I would have liked to see something more interesting, like perhaps the blending of R&B and classical musical theater, there's nothing about the music that is so horrible that I feel the need to not give the film credit for it. Though I will say, for a character determined to be a pop star, Ashanti doesn't actually sing that much in this movie. Whatever, you can keep this one. Comedy. Before I talk about how ravenously horny this movie is, I feel the need to clarify that I have never considered The Muppets children's entertainment. In fact, one of the main reasons The Muppet Show was created was to prevent Jim Henson from being pigeonholed in children's television after working so long on Sesame Street. While Muppets content has always been something you could play with children in the room, and has been loved by many children, this doesn't necessarily mean that it was made for children. I mean, one of the original pilots was called The Muppet Show Sex and Violence. My critique of the sexual humor in The Muppets Wizard of Oz doesn't come from the belief that Muppets should be prudish little saints. It comes from a distaste for bottom-of-the-barrel penis and potty humor that prays that the shock of seeing Gonzo say nipples will make you laugh. There is nothing clever about it. There's barely even setup and payoff, and they don't even lean into the slapstick humor that's been effective in Muppet films and Oz adaptations. I don't care if the Muppets make sex jokes, they certainly have before. I care that they aren't funny. Not to mention that part of what makes the characters so unlikable is how many jokes they make at each other's expense, without ever allowing a moment of stillness for their relationships to develop past that point. I also have a bit of a problem with how many pop culture references there are. Don't get me wrong, the original Muppet Show is literally a variety show with celebrity guests, but I don't have to know who those guests are or why they're famous for the jokes to still be funny. I could name, like, maybe 3 of the celebrity cameos in the original Muppet movie, and that movie still makes me giggle. All of this is to say, the original 1939 Oz film is funnier than this, and it's not even really a comedy. Like I said before, trying to decide what makes a good Oz adaptation and a good Muppet movie is incredibly hard to do. But based on the criteria that I came up with after months of research and a lot of movie nights, it is clear to me that The Muppets Wizard of Oz is a failure as both an Oz adaptation and a Muppet movie. So now what? Can it be fixed? I mean, no, the film has already been made. It is what it is. But hypothetically, if I was given this version of the script and told that I had a little bit more time and a little bit more money, I genuinely think that this film could have been saved. At its core, these are 2 properties that should have been a match made in heaven. And by articulating my issues with The Muppets Wizard of Oz, I've given myself a checklist of things to fix in my rewrites. So here's how I would fix a Muppets Wizard of Oz. In my version of The Muppets Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is desperate to get home, but that doesn't mean she's not a singer. Perhaps Auntie Em has gotten sick. Maybe this isn't the first time a tornado has torn through their small town. Either way, Auntie M's diner is in danger of closing down, and to raise the money to keep it open, Dorothy is hosting a concert fundraiser at the local community center. That, or she's competing in a talent show where the grand prize will offer her family some much-needed financial relief. Think Emmett Otter's jug band Christmas. Either way, Dorothy is still passionate about music. The only difference is that she chooses to use her gift for the betterment of her tight-knit community. The tornado, of course, sweeps her away the morning of the fundraiser, giving her journey to return home a much-needed sense of urgency. If Dorothy can't make her way back to Kansas before the fundraiser, she loses her only opportunity to save her aunt and uncle's livelihood. The Muppets do not exist in this version of Kansas. Instead, the pre-tornado section of the film gives us plenty of time to set up the talent show, while establishing Dorothy's connection to the Kansas community and a loving relationship with Auntie Em. Despite Auntie Em's characterization needing to change quite a bit, I don't think we need to recast Queen Latifah, because to be honest, she deserves a better script anyway. Controversially, I also don't think we need to recast Ashanti. She's no Michael Caine, but I have a strong suspicion that her involvement in the project is a big reason why it got greenlit in the first place, and I'm trying my best to only make changes that I think the production could afford. Which is why I can say with full confidence Quentin Tarantino has gotta fucking go, so that we have room in the budget for a new actress to play the Wicked Witch of the West. But we'll get back to that. While Ashanti may not be a trained actress, I think her performance could be improved by direction that considers the reality of the world. In my version of the movie, Ashanti is directed to speak to the Muppets the same way she'd speak to any other actor. They are adults. If she believes in the world, so will we. And by allowing Dorothy to be a grounded character surrounded by chaos, we can leave the slapstick humor to the experts. The Muppets. When we get to Oz, the character relationships are taken seriously. It isn't undercut with comedy. In fact, the entire comedic style of the film is changed to better match the style of films like Muppet Treasure Island and The Great Muppet Caper. While primarily relying on puns, clever wordplay, and physical comedy, smarter sexual humor and way fewer pop culture references will also tighten the script considerably. This commitment to the relationships and constant kindness is part of what makes Oz so magical. It is a land worth protecting. Speaking of being worth protecting, Pepe is not, and he's gone. I've kicked him out of the window. Instead, Toto will be played by Fufu the dog because I like that this movie has Fufu in it, and I want Fufu to still be in the movie. My brain also has latched on to the concept of the core four plus Toto stumbling across Rolf the dog somewhere, and he is just baffled to be meeting a dog that cannot talk. Pepe will become a henchman to the Wicked Witch of the West. In the month that it has taken me to edit this video, it has also occurred to me that I think Pepe would be really funny as the wizard. When originally writing the script, the wizard wasn't a character I put a lot of thought into recasting because I think the performance in the movie as it stands is fine, but I do think there is something very comical about having a tiny little King Prong with a massive ego being behind all of the fake magic of Oz. I also wouldn't necessarily want to displace the characters who are already serving as the Wicked Witch's henchmen, because I think these characters are often underutilized in Muppet films, and I like that they are so relevant in this one. And it would also give Pepe a larger role than just a henchman, which is probably pretty important since Bill Beretta produced introduced this. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Pepe's humor, I do think a sort of sleazy wizard could be an interesting take on the character that I personally have never seen before, that I think has a lot of comedic potential. Pepe will become a henchman to the Wicked Witch of the West, who will no longer be played by Miss Piggy. Instead, the villain will be played by an incredibly talented human actor.
Someone like, if we could do this 30 years ago, Eartha Kitt, you know, who played the Wicked Witch in like the Madison Square Garden version. Someone who's gonna be like fierce and sing an incredible song about it.
I did do some research to make sure that the timelines of this would all match up. This likely would have been Eartha Kitt's last film, but I think we could have caught her at the very tail end of her retirement from theater.
I wanna be evil. I wanna spit tax. I wanna be evil and cheat at jacks.
Especially because it's the Muppets, and it appears to me like anyone is kind of willing to drop anything to be in a Muppet movie. Miss Piggy isn't absent, though. She'll still play Glinda and the Witch of the North. Since these characters are supposed to be sisters with Eartha Kitt's Wicked Witch of the West, I imagine some jokes about how Piggy looks more like their father and Eartha looks more like their mother. Or you could pull a Great Muppet Caper and have people joke about how they're identical. Either way, I sense some comedic potential in there. With this new casting, I'd love to see the witches in the house replaced with something jazzier. This clear difference in style from the other music would allow the film clearer musical motifs that rely not just on melody, but on instrument. Speaking of music, I think Dorothy needs a clear I Want song, and I would love to see a blend of the pop and R&B Ashanti is known for, with more classic musical theater instruments. Also, I just think that she needs to sing more in general. And of course, the film will be filled with practical effects, especially the scene where the gang meet the wizard for the first time. This is the perfect opportunity for the Muppet team to create puppets that exist outside of the classic Muppet form, with a head, neck, shoulders, and arms, and will be essential to bringing to life the magic of Oz. When Dorothy returns to Kansas, she sings at the fundraiser, securing the funding to save Auntie M's diner. Maybe this is enough for her, but maybe a big-time producer was in the audience all along and offers Dorothy a chance to tour the country with her music. It's far-fetched, but this is a Muppet movie. In the same way Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr played the farmhands in the 1939 film, I like the idea of these producers being played by Steve Whitmire, Dave Goelz, and Eric Jacobson, respectively. Dorothy could agree to tour with the promise of sending money back home to her family, but I think it would be even more powerful if she said no, proving that she's content with her Kansas community, because after all, there is no place like home. So that's how I would begin to fix The Muppets Wizard of Oz, and not to toot my own horn, but I do think it fixes a lot of the issues that I personally have with it. But I also want to make it abundantly clear that everyone is allowed to have their own opinions. I have no authority to tell you what movies you can and can't like, and to pretend like everything I just said is objective is not a noble pursuit. It can be hard for me to separate my consumer brain from my critic brain, and so I find myself constantly trying to justify my opinions. And that's exactly what this video is. Opinions.
My husband and I were just having a conversation this weekend about how we hate the phrase guilty pleasure, because if you like it, there's no reason to be guilty about it. I weep for people who can't enjoy something that they might enjoy because they feel like they have to look at it academically or always be investigating what makes it good or what makes it bad or what makes it relevant.
Whether you love or hate The Muppets Wizard of Oz, its legacy is unfortunately tainted by what could have been. And I hope this video taught you a little bit more about what went wrong and how that might have happened. What do you think? Do you like The Muppets Wizard of Oz? Is there an Oz adaptation you love that I never mentioned? How would you have fixed the movie? Let me know in the comments down below. Like always, my videos are unsponsored, so if you'd like to support me and help me make more consistent, high-quality videos, feel free to donate to the Venmo or Ko-Fi linked in my description box. Thank you so much to Brianna for letting me interview her, and thank you for watching! Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!